بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
The Prophet ﷺ, to show his prophethood, Allah Ta'ala would address him as a slave. And the next, furthermore, in the following section, he's going to mention, the Quran actually censures the Prophet ﷺ. Like it corrects him and speaks to him and threatens him that you are entrusted, you are not privileged to do what you want or speak on behalf of God as how you want. And so if the Prophet ﷺ was claiming, if he was writing this book of his own accord, would he speak to himself like that, in that manner? Would he address himself as a slave? Or say that if you were to speak, وَلَوْ تَقَوَّلَ عَلَيْنَا بَعْضَ الْأَقَاوِيلِ لَأَخَذْنَاهُ بِالْيَمِينِ. If he was to fabricate some statements about us, we would have taken him by his jugular vein. This is the threat the Quran mentions, like, this is an amana. This is the revelation of God. There is no leniency in that responsibility. Rather, there is severe accountability and severe judgment for a prophet who might fail his duty. And so the Quran makes that clear. If the Prophet ﷺ was to fabricate the Quran, if he was to author the Quran, would he make such critical statements about his own self? Absolutely not. It is irrational. It wouldn't make sense. And we see that these imposter prophets, and in the most recent here in the United States, we have Elijah Muhammad. What did he do? He exploited the people. He took advantage of them. Right? And you see that. And this has been by every arrogant, self-centered leader who uses religion to amass power. You can tell the sincere one from the insincere. The insincere are always using religion for self-grandization. Right? They want to empower themselves. They want to access things for themselves. And the Prophet ﷺ was the complete opposite. He said, if you want to find me with the poor. Right? If you're looking for me, he said, seek me with the weak. That's where you'll find me. He said, I was given a choice to be a prophet king or a prophet slave. I chose to be a prophet slave. Right? And so the Prophet ﷺ, he humbled himself to show he's the complete opposite of one that would seek self-fulfillment and self-power. And so we're going to move on to the fifth possibility. Could the Prophet ﷺ have authored the Quran himself? The Quran corrects and censures the Prophet ﷺ. He states, the Quran corrects and censures the Prophet ﷺ. For example, when there was a blind man who interrupted him as he spoke to prominent members of the Quraysh, the Prophet ﷺ's face changed because of his displeasure, and he frowned and turned away. The Quran censures him by saying, he frowned and turned away when the blind man came to him, even though he might purify himself. This is the famous story of Abasa wa Tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma. He frowned and turned away when the blind man came to him. And so the Prophet ﷺ made a judgment call. His judgment call was, he's speaking to these prominent leaders of Mecca, and he's calling them to Islam. And this blind man comes and he interrupts this meeting to learn from the Prophet. And so the Prophet ﷺ frowns at him, disturbed by this man's interruption. And the Quran says that was wrong, because this man was seeking guidance. He should have been prioritized, not these chieftains who had no interest in your message. And the Quran, these verses are recited until today. If the Prophet had authored the Quran, would he criticize himself in such a way? In verses to be recited until the day of Qiyamah? Right? Who would want to be embarrassed? Like, imagine an awkward moment among people and you're called out. Would you ever want people to remember that? Every time you think about it, you're shaking your head just wanting to forget it. And now the Quran mentions it. Would it be possible that he authored the Quran just to mention this mistake that was made? Right? And so that eliminates the possibility that the Quran could have been written by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he says, and by the way, the prophets can make mistakes. They don't make sins. This was a mistake, right? That he prioritized the chieftains over the blind man. The Prophet made a judgment call. He thought that these chieftains are prominent leaders of Mecca. I am preaching to them. If they accept Islam, it will transform the field of da'wah in Mecca. It will ensure well-being for the entire Muslim community. But the fact, what was overlooked in that case was this man had a sincere heart and these people didn't. And so we don't prioritize people because of their power in social class or what influence they might have. We prioritize people over what they are willing to do right now. And this man wanted to draw close to God. And so therefore Allah said, he is the one that should have been prioritized. And that the frowning towards him was an incorrect response. Right? And so this is also a lesson regarding the Prophet ﷺ, that the Quran will correct him. And this is possible. He is infallible. He does not commit major sins. He is infallible with regards to revelation. He does not forget any part of the revelation or distort it. But he can make judgment calls that are incorrect. And the Quran would correct him. And this also shows that the Prophet ﷺ had autonomy to make his own decisions on certain matters. And we see this in the seerah, and we can talk about it later. He made certain decisions regarding the battle of Badr, and he was even questioning, O Messenger of God, are we in this position because it was a command, or are you adopting this position because of strategy? He said because of strategy. So the companions said, no, we should go take this position and go in front of the wells so they don't have access to the water. So it showed that the Prophet ﷺ, all of his there were judgments that were non-religious related. And sometimes some scholars even said that he could make judgments about religion, that he could prescribe laws, and the Quran would either come and approve them or disprove them. And so that's a very deeper subject, and we can study that in the science of usul al-fiqh. But I just wanted to put that out there for you guys to have a little bit of awareness about what the prophets are infallible of, and what they are possibly fallible with, and what autonomy they have with regards to their authority as prophets, and if they can legislate, if they can make judgments of their own, and if they are allowed to kind of legislate law, and how that would work with this authority of the Quran. So I just wanted to, I guess, to provide that as something additional. But continuing, he says, if the Prophet ﷺ had authored the Quran himself, he would be an impostor who was claiming to be God's messenger for selfish motives. Someone with those selfish motives would not have censured themselves in the Quran. They would instead have exalted themselves so that they would gain influence and control through others' preference of them. This too is evidence that the Prophet ﷺ did not author the Quran himself, but he was taught it by someone else. The Quran commands the Prophet ﷺ to do things that he did not want to do. The most famous example of the Quran commanding the Prophet ﷺ to do something that he did not want to do was its commanding him to marry the ex-wife of his previously adopted son, Zayd. فَلَمَّا قَضَى زَيْدٌ مِنْهَا وَطَرٍ, right? Zayd ibn Haritha. So Zayd was a former adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ. Before that, he was a slave. The Prophet ﷺ had adopted him to be his own son. Eventually, this rule of adoption was changed because in Islam, you can't take the last names of anyone besides your biological father. And so Zayd, when he was adopted by the Prophet ﷺ, he took the last name of Prophet Muhammad. He said, Zayd ibn Muhammad. The Quran came and said, you cannot take the last name of anyone but your biological father. And so when this happened, still Zayd was seen as part of the household of the Prophet ﷺ. He was seen as a person that grew up who was a member of the household of the Prophet ﷺ. His son, Osama, was dearly beloved to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ used to always keep him close. They would say, Osama is the beloved son of the beloved, to the Messenger ﷺ. They were beloved, right? What happened? Zayd married, if I recall correctly, Zainab bin Jahsh. And she was a relative of the Prophet ﷺ, from the same tribe or clan. And so Zayd eventually divorced her. And the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran married her to him. But the Prophet ﷺ felt shameful. How could he marry the ex-wife of his stepson? And the Quran mentioned this, that you were hesitant. You feared the criticism of people, what they would say about you, that you would marry the stepson or the ex-wife of your adopted son. And so the Quran calls him out on this in Surah Al-Ahzab. وَتَخْشَى النَّاسَ وَاللَّهُ أَحَقُّ أَن تَخْشَاهُ. And you fear people, and Allah is more deserving of your fear. Right? And so the Quran calls him out. If the Prophet had taught the Quran, authored the Quran, would he have said this about himself? Would he have addressed this in this manner about himself? Never. To show that this Quran was taught to him and it wasn't something that was produced by him, alayhi salatu wassalam. Continuing. So we eliminated the possibility that the Prophet ﷺ could not have authored the Quran. Everything about the Quran indicates that he was taught it. Not that he was just taught it, but he had no authority over what was in it. He was given it, this is it, deliver it as is. There is no option to take out, modify, edit, or delete anything from the Quran.